Mr. President, I stand today to explain my reasons for voting against the debt limit increase that we'll be voting on in just about a half an hour from now. This is a crisis that America faces. It's an ongoing crisis that will neither be created nor eliminated with today's vote. This is a crisis that has been building gradually over the course of years, decades, in fact. It's a crisis that we've certainly known about ever since this Congress was sworn in January of this year. This is a crisis that threatens potentially every federal program, from defense to entitlements. Because as we continue to borrow more money as a nation, adding to the already almost $15 trillion that we've accumulated in national debt, roughly $50,000 for every man, woman, and child in America, roughly every $150,000 for every taxpayer in America. As we continue to add to that enormous debt, we get closer and closer to the unknown, but nonetheless existing point at which we will no longer be able to borrow, at least not at interest rates that will make this kind of borrowing sustainable. If interest rates were to go up even to their historically average levels, within just a few years we could be spending something closer to $1 trillion every single year just to pay the interest on our national debt. We could be paying more than we pay on Social Security in an entire year, more than Medicare and Medicaid combined, more than national defense in an entire year. What happens when we get to that point? Where does that money come from? The reality is that every federal program, from defense to entitlements, could see its coffers raided in an unfortunate draconian display of fiscal irresponsibility if we continue to punt this problem and not to address it. The legislation at issue today addresses this problem by perpetuating it. I am pleased, of course, that this legislation does certain things and has invigorated a new conversation in the sorts of strategies that need to be in place if we're ever going to address this problem on a long-term basis. 7 or 8 months ago, there were still people in this town in Washington, D.C. who were saying things along the lines of, we need another stimulus package, or we need more federal spending of one sort or another. They're no longer saying that. Now the discussion focuses not on whether to cut, but how much. There is, of course, renewed discussion about the need for a balanced budget amendment. But talk is different than outcomes. What we need are outcomes. What we need is a fundamental change to the way we spend money in Washington. What we need is to restrict Congress's authority granted by Clause 2 of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution to incur debt in the name of the United States. That power needs to be restricted. The only way we can restrict that on a permanent basis, one that will bind not only this Congress but future Congresses that come after us, is through an amendment to the Constitution. This legislation raises the debt limit by about $2.5 trillion. This is a record-breaking sum. Not too many years ago, when I was in high school, this was roughly equivalent to our entire national debt. Now, through one piece of legislation, we're increasing, expanding our already huge national debt by roughly that same sum. And it doesn't contain any permanent binding structural spending reform mechanism of the sort that will be necessary to make sure that we get out of this problem, to make sure that we end the problem that we've created through Congress's reckless pattern of perpetual deficit spending. That's why I've insisted since before I was even sworn into office that before we raise the debt limit, we need to pass a balanced budget amendment and submit it to the states for ratification. Nearly every state balances its budget each and every year. It's not news when a state does this. I look forward to the time when it will no longer be news when Congress does the same. Now, there are significant cuts discussed in this legislation and proposed, but I want to be clear on one thing. Although these cuts are large on a long-term basis, on a short-term basis, they are less so. On a short-term basis, within the next year, this proposes to cut about $7 billion out of the fiscal year 2012 discretionary spending budget. Some dispute this number and suggest, as some of my colleagues have already, that in fact the fiscal year 2012 budget will spend $23 billion more. Others concede the point and say, okay, let's assume for purposes of this discussion that it does in fact cut $7 billion from what otherwise would be new deficit spending. $7 billion is roughly equivalent to the amount of debt that we've added to our total debt portfolio just in the last 30 hours or so, roughly the period of time that has elapsed since this legislation was announced late Sunday night until this very moment. Because we're borrowing about $4 billion of new debt every single day. Stated differently, this amounts to less than 0.2% of a cut. I do believe that we have made progress, and I commend our leadership for working so hard to focus the discussion on the need for cuts. We have unfortunately had Democratic leadership in this body that has been bent on delaying the announcement of any deal as long as possible, on preventing legislation like the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act from coming to the floor, where it could have been subjected to an open debate, discussion, and amendment process, as well it should have been. I regret the fact that it didn't come to that. The fact that that legislation, which could have solved this problem, could have and would have put us on a path toward fiscal responsibility, toward ending this problem once and for all, was not even allowed its day in the U.S. Senate to be debated and discussed on the merits. At the end of the day, we have to come to terms with the fact that the course we're on from a fiscal standpoint is utterly unsustainable. Adding more debt to our already bursting portfolio of debt is only going to contribute to this problem unless, of course, we move forward and adopt a balanced budget amendment. I believe the time to do that is right now. The American people overwhelmingly support this, to the tune of about 75%. To my great astonishment, some of my colleagues, and even the President of the United States, have suggested that this is somehow a radical idea, or an idea that is so radical as to be absurd and not worth considering a balanced budget amendment, even though 3 out of every 4 Americans believes that we need a balanced budget amendment. I want to close by referring to a quote by a man named William Morris, who in the late 1800s gave us the following quote. He said, "One man with an idea in his head is in danger of being considered a madman. 2 men with the same idea in common may be foolish, but can hardly be mad. 10 men sharing an idea begin to act. 100 draw attention as fanatics. 1,000 and society begins to tremble. 100,000 and there is war abroad, and the cause has victories tangible and real. And why only 100,000? Why not 100 million and peace upon the earth? You and I who agree together, it is we who have to answer that question." It's not just 1 or 2 of us who have this idea in our head that we need to restrict Congress's borrowing power because that power has been so severely abused over such a prolonged period of time. It's 3 out of every 4 Americans. And I urge each of my colleagues in the Senate and each of our counterparts in the House of Representatives to join the American people in at least the same proportion in supporting the idea that never again should we raise the debt limit without a balanced budget amendment in place. This is a permanent, long-term problem. It requires a permanent solution. The only permanent solution is that which involves an amendment to the Constitution. Thank you, Mr. President.